here, Corey Sawyers, and we're excited for the message that he's going to bring to us tonight. But want to get you or make you aware of several things before I introduce him. We'll have a couple of songs, prayer, and then we'll dismiss the kids to class tonight. Just as far as announcements goes, Danny Agee had gallbladder surgery yesterday. I've been out of town all day, and I have not gotten an update on him. I know he stayed overnight, and I say he is home or he is okay. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay. So those of you who know, Denny had surgery on his gallbladder, and they were wanting to do it robotically, but it just was not allowed to. So they had to the way his situation had to go in and remove it. I guess the old-fashioned way. I don't even know what that means, but anyway, he had to stay overnight. He is at home now, so glad for that. Frank Moore is in ICU at the hospital in room 741. He's dealing with several issues. Please continue to remember him in your prayers. Dave Dahl had his kidney stone removed this past Thursday. He's going to Vanderbilt next week for the heart evaluation. Tony Powell, continue to remember him, and Katie Mansfield, Charlotte Lowe as well. Also, Buford Mathis, who's the brother of Betty Delaney, is battling cancer, and Jason Delaney, who's Wally and Betty Delaney's son, is dealing with a lot of pain issues as well. We also want to offer our condolences to the family of Harold Thorpe, passed away last week. I think funeral services on Monday, and then tonight's visitation, and then tomorrow visitation from 11 to 1 at Ronk Funeral Home for Cindy's father, Franklin Turnage, and I know we put those out in the announcements as well, but want to remember that family. Also, Pat Hutchison passed away. I know that we've had a lot of you who are newer to our congregation before Miss Pat ended up going to the nursing home. I don't even know how long ago, but several years ago. And so she has been in the nursing home, and she passed away Sunday evening, and graveside services were held today. So we'll remember her and her family that's still living here around Crockett County as well. Got several activities coming up to mark your calendars with. The youth group is going to float the buffalo on the 17th, and then on Sunday after our PM services, there'll be a general business meeting following services there. Next speaker next week is James Hall. I'm excited about him being here as well. And our Senior Saints event is coming up on the 27th. Mark your calendar. It'll be in the fellowship room in the back. And I have sent out a text to those of you who are part of that. If you're not getting those text messages and you're part of Senior Saints, please let me know. Be glad to add you to it. Tonight, our speaker is Corey Sawyers. He is he's been in full-time ministry since 1996, but he has been at Martin, Church of Christ there in Martin since 2020. He is an adjunct instructor for Bear Valley Bible Institute. He grew up in Dresden. His wife, Melody, is here with him tonight. They have 3 sons. Garrett, who's a youth minister in Texas, and he's married to Bailey. Gordon and his wife, Lauren, are attending Bear Valley training for ministry right now. And then Gannon, is I saying that right, Gannon? Okay. Gannon is still at home but wants to go into ministry one day. I asked him to give me something interesting about himself. He said, I'm really not that interesting. I expected an amen from these folks over here, but they didn't. They just accepted it. All right. He was bivocational for a while, preaching part-time and helping with his family business, which is Greenfield Monument Works. So if you've ever dealt with them, that's his family. And he was the one that, I guess, designed and helped design, installed the Veterans Monument here on our court square. So I know that several of you have loved ones whose names that are listed there, and he was a big part of doing that. And I'm excited. I've heard him speak several times, and he's very engaging and very just going to do a good job tonight, I have no doubt. And the topic of joy is what we've been studying through the summer, and look forward to his topic tonight of joy in trials. At this time, is Brooks here? Did I miss him? He's speaking. So who's leading? Jack's leading the singing. I was fixing to grab a songbook and go. All right, Jack, come on, let's go. 2 songs, and then we'll have our prayer, and then we'll dismiss to class.
We're starting with As the Deer, number 71. If y'all want to look in your songbooks. As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. You alone are my strength, my shield. To you alone may my spirit yield. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. I want you more than gold or silver, only you can satisfy. You alone are the real joy giver and the apple of my eye. You alone are my strength, my shield. To you alone may my spirit yield. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. Our next song is number 881. 881. I'm satisfied with just the cottage below, a little silver and a little gold. But in that city where the ransom will shine, I want a gold one, that silver line. I've got a mansion just over the hilltop, in that bright land where we'll never grow old. And someday yonder we'll never more wander, but walk the streets that are purest gold. Don't think me poor or deserted or lonely, I'm not discouraged, I'm heaven bound. I'm just a pilgrim in search of a city. I want a mansion, a robe and a crown. I've got a mansion just over the hilltop, in that bright land when we'll never grow old. And someday yonder we'll never more wander, but walk the streets that are purest gold.
I'm going to move this out of the way so that I don't. Oh, I forgot. That's offsides, isn't it? Tennessee fan got offsides on Alabama. We do that too much.
Dear Lord, thank you for this day. We come here this midweek Bible study to study and worship your word and song and hymns and dive into your word that we may be stronger in our faith and stronger Christians. Lord, be with all those of our number and community that we've been mentioning here tonight. Be dealing with grieving, with the loss of loved ones, or maybe dealing with illness, that you may be there for them and put your hands upon them where they would be comfort and have comfort of you, Lord. Be with all the teachers tonight and children, other kids here, that they may learn and
We have too many penalties against them as it is. It had to be an Alabama fan getting up here, you know. Well, good evening. Good evening. All right. If y'all had already fallen asleep, we're going to be in real trouble. There's a little orange around in here. So, anyway, only Jesus could bring all these different kinds of things together in the South, you know. But I'm thankful to be here tonight. Thankful for the opportunity. This is the first time I've ever gotten to preach at Alamo. And I bring greetings from Will Norrid. He texted me today, and he said, "That's a bunch of good folks down there." And I said, "I know." And I said, "After I preach, they'll be really anxious for you to get down there and preach, you know." But anyway, we thank the world of Will, and I thank the world of Bobby. And I really felt at home when we came in tonight. Of course, John and Linda, I don't know where they went. John and Linda, they may not want me telling this. They're family. John's a cousin of mine. And we're just close enough kin that if one of us was to win $1 million, we could hound each other, but just far enough that we don't have to claim each other all the time. But then Charlie and Jan Neal are here, one of my former elders when I preached up at Paris, Tennessee. And then, last but not least, y'all got the same wreath on your door Melly's got hanging on our door at the house. So anyway, it's just good to be here. And I told my boys today, I was texting with them, and one of them asked me what I was preaching on tonight, and I said, well, the summer series is on joy, and I'm the summer bummer because we're going to talk about trials tonight, joy in trials. So if you'll open up your Bibles to James chapter 1, that's where we're going to begin this evening. And there's no better way maybe to start a sermon in the middle of a series on joy than with a creepy-looking guy holding a knife, of course. But imagine your child is needing open heart surgery. And a surgeon comes into the room and he's carrying a scalpel. And if it was any other person, any other stranger that was walking towards your child with a knife, you'd tackle him, right? But with the surgeon, you willingly hand your child over to him, not because you enjoy what he's about to do, but because you trust what he intends to accomplish. Pain with purpose is entirely different than pain with no purpose, right? When you think about our lives, what we go through, I don't know about y'all, but sometimes I just get tired. I'm tired. Part of that's because I'm 52 now. Part of that's because of what we have to deal with here in this life. I'm tired. Are you? I'm tired. Ministry is literally the best of times and it's the worst of times. It's why I love and appreciate ministers like Will and Bobby so much. Because we get asked to be at the best moments in people's lives, at graduations and at weddings and at births and retirements and anniversaries, baptisms. But we're also wanted to be there in the worst of times, when there's marital problems or disputes or diagnosis or wayward children or addictions or deaths. And I see so many people that I love that have to deal with things that are tough, that are difficult, like sorrow. This past Monday, we had a funeral for a man who was just a pillar in our church and our community for years. One who was a great example to everyone in so many ways, not the least of which was the fact that he and his wife, until he died, had been married for 77 years. Always had a compliment, always had an encouragement, and yet his life was so full of tragedy. I preached the funeral sermon for his son 2 years ago. Sorrow. I'm tired of sorrow. I'm tired of pain. We have a man in our congregation who was in full-time ministry for years in Louisiana and Mississippi and Kentucky, and he's retired now, and he and his family worship with us, and he's one of my greatest encouragers. He's one I can lean on, and is always has something good to say. And he still loves teaching. He still loves one-on-one and classroom teaching. He loves nothing more than to be at the assembly with our church family. But he hadn't been able to be there for a while because of the pain that he has in his knees and his back that's just overwhelming every other aspect of his life. I'm tired of pain. I'm tired of sickness. We have a couple that have not only served in our church for years, but our community. They're one of those that everyone in the community gets them to be on every kind of event planning or board or whatever they can because they're just servants. In fact, the husband has been serving as one of our elders for the last several years. He just recently resigned. They're retired. And one of the reasons he resigned and they retired is because they have grown children and growing grandchildren that live a couple of states away in both directions. And they wanted to travel and see them more and visit them more. And just about the time they got into that season of their life, she was diagnosed with breast cancer that spread. And now her calendar is full of doctor's appointments and chemotherapy appointments and radiation appointments. I'm tired of sickness. I'm tired of problems. We have a couple in our congregation, that wonderful young couple, two small little girls, that's really having some difficult marital problems that I've been studying with and working with. We've got a man that we're working with that just got out of rehab 2 days ago, and the next day he was in the hospital in the ER because he'd already fallen back off the horse. We've got a couple that's raising a young son who's having some terrible financial situations, not from their own doing necessarily, and really are struggling on what to do. I'm tired of problems. I'm tired. What about y'all? You're studying joy, right? How do I sing, I've got the joy, 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 joy down in my heart? How do I sing that when what I feel like singing sometime is the song from Hee Haw? You remember Hee Haw? We saw it on a retro channel here a while back, and I told my boys, here's a show we watched when I was a kid, and first time some of the girls come out, I'm covering their eyes saying, I must be a better parent than my parents was. But anyway, you remember the song they would sing, gloom, despair, and agony on me. How do I sing, I've got the joy, 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 joy down in my heart, when I want to sing gloom, despair, and agony on me? And yet, we turn to James chapter 1, and I hope you will if you haven't already. We turn to James chapter 1, and we see a short introduction. It's only one verse long, and then we get only to the second verse of the book, and we see an almost impossible task. It's an imperative. It's a command, not a suggestion. And notice what he says. He says, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. Count it all joy. Your translation may say something like, consider it all joy. What? What did he say? Verse 2 of chapter 1. That's where you want to go, James? Joy and trials, they don't even belong in the same sentence, much less the same Bible verse, do they? Much less when I think about that I'm tired. But as we study through this text tonight, what we find is that so much of trials and joy is all about perspective. And that's really the idea that I want you to remember tonight, is that our perspective determines our joy. Our perspective determines our joy. In fact, before we get really into the meat of the lesson, I want to focus in on that first line of verse 2 to help us to see that. First, let's focus in on that idea of joy. We sometimes, when we read this verse, we kind of almost want to lessen it and say it's not really like happiness, it's just joy. Well, what is that? It's like knowing that God is with me and I can be sad anyway. Well, that's not really what the word means. The word in the original language means gladness, to rejoice, joy. That's what it means. And you can really see it in how that it's used in the New Testament. Throughout the New Testament, you see this word used, and you can look at the verses and write them down and go back and look, but it's used as the opposite of sorrow. It's used as the opposite of pain. This word is used to describe the reaction of the disciples when they saw the empty tomb of Jesus. It's used whenever a friend of Peter's, who they all thought that he was dead at that point, rightfully so, they thought he was dead, but they found out he was alive, and this is what they felt was joy. It's the emotion that was stirred within people when they found out the report about people being converted to Jesus, of healings, all the different healings that were going on. When they heard about that, this joy that they had. It's also talked about in terms of love in Philemon chapter 7, about verse 7 rather, the idea of the love and the joy that Paul said that he had brought to him. Romans 15 and verse 13 maybe is the best, because it tells us that this joy is something that is from God. And maybe that's the idea. It's real joy. It's real joy. Now, sometimes tonight you're going to be frowning because I'm going to talk about bad things. We're talking about trials. But sometimes tonight you need to smile because it's good things. Okay? And if you fall asleep, I'll start all over and you won't know the difference, right? It's real joy that he's talking about. Maybe Romans 15:13 is the only distinction that can really be made, is that joy comes from God. Happiness comes from what happens around us, the happenstances of life. Happiness is dictated on whether things are going well or things are not going well. But since joy is from God, if we've got God, we've got joy, real happiness, real joy. Now understand what James is telling us here. The joy is not in the trial. We're not happy that we're going through a trial. We're not rejoicing that we're having to go through a trial, but knowing that the trial can help us, to make us stronger, to make us better able to endure. By the way, there's probably someone in this room, maybe multiple people in this room, that are going through trials right now. In the middle of a trial is not the time to try to convince people of what we're going to talk about tonight. That's not. We've got to do these things ahead of time. But if you're in the midst of a trial, hopefully these things can at least help. These decisions really need to be made before the trial comes. But notice the other thing that he talks about here. He says, count it all joy. Count it all joy. That word, count, is the first of, I said it was an imperative or a command, the first of 62 imperatives or commands in this little 5-chapter book. He's really laying it down on them, right? But the word here, James is not saying that we should enjoy trials or that we ought to be happy when bad things happen to us. In fact, when we get down to verses 3 and 4, he's going to tell us why we're to consider these trials as joy. But the word count or consider, whatever your translation has, in the Greek, if you're Greek, you don't have to know Greek to go to heaven, but you can find some cool things. It's a middle imperative. And by middle, what that means is it's something we have to do to ourselves. We're the ones that no one else can do it for us. We're the ones that have to do that. It's the same word that's used in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 6 when it says that Jesus didn't count holding on to His godness as something to be held on. He didn't count that as that. It's the same word used in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 7 where Paul, after he gives his resume, he said, I count all of those things, or I consider all of those things to be lost except for knowing Jesus. None of that. I've made up my mind that nothing matters like knowing Jesus. And really that's the idea that the word means, is to lead out. In other words, what he's saying is that you've got to lead your mind to think. It's not something that when you go through a trial, you're naturally going to say, boy, isn't this a joyous occasion? It's something you've got to lead yourself into thinking that way. Does that make sense? And notice that he's addressing here, my brethren. That's another key word in James. He uses it 19 times, and it shows the devotion and the humbleness and the closeness that he felt with them. And I hope that kind of love is the way you feel in this lesson. But James' answer is this, that our perspective determines our joy. And there's 4 lessons that he teaches us about trials that can help us have the right kind of perspective about that. First of all, trials happen. Notice in verse 2, James says, when you meet trials of various kinds, you've got to lead your mind to consider it, to count it as joy when you meet trials of various kinds. When you meet, the word that's translated there, when you meet, is a word that only has a couple of other occurrences in the entire Bible. In Luke chapter 16, when Jesus is telling the story about what we call the Good Samaritan, you remember he says a man is traveling on the road between Jericho and Jerusalem, and he fell among thieves. That word fell is our word that he says here, when you meet. In Acts chapter 28, or 27 rather, in verse 41, when Paul is on the boat and he's trying to make his way to Rome, he's appealed to Caesar, and he's on this boat, and there's this big storm as they're crossing the sea, trying to get there. Not really the time of year for traveling across that way, but here they are, and there's this huge storm, and they've tried everything else, and finally it says that they struck a reef where 2 seas met. That word struck is our same word as meet. And the idea that's behind this word is it's something that just kind of happens. It's something that you didn't plan for, you didn't expect, you didn't want, but it happened. That's what he says about these trials. He doesn't say if you have. He doesn't say that there might be some trials. He says when you meet. When these things happen and you don't want them to happen and you're not expecting them to happen, you don't know that they're going to happen, you got to consider it joy. It's kind of like when you go on a flight, if you've traveled very much, almost every flight that I've been on, almost every pilot at some point in his pre-flight announcements makes the same, at least one address that's the same. He says, we're expecting turbulence on this flight. Have you ever heard that before? Every flight that I've been on, I've heard, we're expecting turbulence on this flight. In fact, I would almost feel like something was up if I was on a flight and the pilot says, we're expecting smooth sailing on this flight. I would think, there's something right. He don't know what he's talking about, The idea of whatever flight you're on, there's always a possibility it's not really matter if we're going to get into some rough air, it's when we're going to get into rough air. And any more than that, what are you going to do when you hit that rough air? First time I ever flew was when we went on our honeymoon. Right? I'm the man of the house now, protector of my wife. And it was a pretty smooth flight, except for the fact my legs shaking was really what caused the turbulence on that flight. But on the way back home, it was bad. And Melody had flown many times before, and she, even she was a little scared. And so I'm putting my arm around her. It'll be all right, dear, Meanwhile, I'm going, Lord, are you going to make me die right after my honeymoon? How do we react to it? Well, James is like a seasoned pilot. And what he's saying is fasten your seatbelt because trials are coming. And this word brings the idea of sudden and unexpected. Again, the man traveling on that road between Jerusalem and Jericho didn't want to fall among thieves, but guess what? It happened. They're sailing in that boat across the sea. They didn't want it to run up on the rocks and crash, but guess what? It happened. Trials tend to fall upon us when we least expect them. But if we understand that they happen, sometimes we get this notion in our heads of that woe is me, it only happens to me. Look how bad things are in my life. Why did this happen to me? You remember the Calgon commercials? Calgon, take me away. Some of you are old enough, you're not. Some of you younger ones going, what is Calgon? You can look it up on YouTube later. But look, all the things bad happening to me. If we have the perspective to understand that it's not anything personal, that it just happens to all of us, then our perspective can be what it should, and our perspective determines our joy. Number 2 lesson that we learn in this passage is that trials differ. Notice what he says here in verse 2. He says, when you meet trials of various kinds. He says they are various. That word means varied or different or even multicolored trials. In other words, these trials that we're going to have happen to us, they come in all sizes and all shapes, right? Peter uses the same word in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 6 when he talks about how that for a short time we're distressed by various trials. It's also used, this word, in the Gospels in Matthew chapter 4 to describe all the different kind of miracles that Jesus performed. Lots of different kinds of miracles. Here's what I thought was most interesting, is that in the Septuagint, that's the Greek translation of the Old Testament, this is the word that they use in Genesis chapter 37 when it describes the coat that Joseph got. This is the word. That coat of many colors, it's a multicolored coat. Think about how many colors are on the Pantene spectrum, right? Like one of the problems we have in Tennessee, I don't know if y'all have it in Alabama, it's hard for us to get the right shade of orange. I don't know what it is, but there is an orange that's Tennessee orange, and then there's different oranges that aren't Tennessee orange, right? In fact, my son living in Texas, says they try to tell him that theirs is the real orange. I said, that's brown at Texas. That ain't even orange, you know. All the different shades, all the different colors, and that's what he's saying here is that you might be having a blue day one day, and next day you're having a gray day. That one day you may be green with envy, the next day you may be red hot with anger. That you may have some trials that are big and some trials that are small. Some trials that are over pretty quickly and some trials that last for a really long time. There's physical trials and spiritual trials and emotional trials. But this word that's translated trials can be translated in one of two ways. I didn't even flip the slide for you there. This word can be translated in two different ways. It can be talked about as something that comes from the outside, and usually you see it's something like when it falls on you, or when it becomes on you, or when it happens to you, or when you meet, like in this verse, something that comes on the outside. It's talking about something that's happening that tests your faith, that tests your resolve, that tests your wherewithal. And then it's used sometimes to talk about things that come from within us. Like later on in James chapter 1, he's going to talk about that. These temptations that come from our own desires of our heart, where we're tempted to do something that is wrong. The idea here, though, of course, that he's talking about here, these are things that are going to come from the outside. And they're just as much, maybe sometimes even more, a test of our faith than the temptations that come from our own lusts, our own desires. They come in all shapes and sizes, and the only thing that they really have in common is that they all test us to some degree. Like what? Well, like trials of persecution, where people are made fun of or they're hurt or even put to death because of their faith. Like affliction, and this is kind of maybe a generic idea of something that causes pain or suffering, like leukemia or cancer or whatever, or maybe even something like that would cause emotional pain, like losing a family member or having a loss of an emotional connection with somebody. Adversity, it would be difficulties or misfortunes, or we might just call them hurdles that have been thrown in life's path in our way. Stuff happens that we just makes life hard and difficult for us sometimes. Sin, of course, sometimes causes these trials to happen. Maybe it's from our own sins, that the results of that, jail or sickness or whatever. Think about like the days of Noah and the flood. Think about like the Garden of Eden and the results of the sin that Adam and Eve had to bear. Sometimes it's from the sins of others. Think about maybe someone that's been hit by a drunken driver. Not their sin, but someone else's. And then sometimes it's just mysterious. Like, remember the book of Job? As far as we know, if you hold the view that Job wrote the book of Job, then God maybe revealed it later on. But Job goes through the whole time and he doesn't know he doesn't have the preview that we do to see chapters 1 and 2. He doesn't know why it's happened. He don't know what's going on. He thinks that God's forgotten about him, doesn't care about him, or that there's some kind of bookkeeping error in heaven where he's being punished for somebody else's sin. And when all he wants is, I want to stand before God. And when God finally stands before him, God basically says, you don't know what you're talking about, just trust me. And he never did, as far as we see in the text, never did he tell him what it was that happened. But Job was expected to trust. Sometimes we just don't know why we're suffering, and we may never. But he says we're to consider when we go through those things, not the difficulty or the persecution or the adversity. We're not to consider that joy, but going through, when we have to go through it, we're to consider, to realize we're not happy or joyful that we're going through hard times or difficult times. But the proper perspective helps us realize that with all of these, whatever life is throwing at us, that there can be something good that comes out of it. That's what he's going to get to in just a minute in verse 3. It's kind of like if you've ever walked into an emergency room on any given night, you'll walk down the hallway and you'll look in those little rooms, and in one room there may be a child that's fallen off his bicycle and broken his arm, and in another room there may be an elderly man who's had a heart attack. Another one has a young mother holding a feverish baby. Another room has someone who's just in a car accident. Another room has someone who's being diagnosed with cancer. Everyone is in the same building. Everyone is hurting, but no two stories are the same. And on every Sunday morning and every Sunday night and every Wednesday night that we gather together, that's the church. We're all sitting in the same pews. We're all praying the same prayers. We're all singing the same songs. We're all listening to the same sermon. But if we could see in all the hearts of everybody in this room tonight, you know what we would see? Various trials. One family is grieving. One couple is working hard to try to save their marriage. One teenager is battling anxiety. One man is worried about keeping his job. One woman is caring for a spouse with dementia. One young person is trying to remain faithful despite the pressure being put on them at school. James says trials are various, multicolored. They don't all look alike, but every one of them has the potential to strengthen our faith. And sometimes, again, we have this mindset or this idea that I'm suffering worse or I'm going through worse than anybody else. But if we realize that trials are just different, that no one knows how I feel or what I'm going through. I may not have walked in your shoes exactly, but all of us have dealt with things, and all of us are dealing with things. Then suddenly it doesn't feel so like, woe is me, but it feels like maybe there's something better that can come out of this. Our perspective determines our joy. Lesson number 3 that James teaches us here is that trials produce. Notice in verse 3, it says, "For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness." We are to consider trials joy because if we understand things from God's perspective, that we can see that the end result is steadfastness or endurance or patience, whatever your English translation may say. He says, "For you know." You know, there's 2 different words for know in Greek. Again, you don't have to know Greek to go to heaven, but it's kind of a cool thing to realize. Some of it is book knowledge. Some of it is experiential knowledge. And a buddy of mine always tries to describe this by saying you can join the Army and you go in the airborne, and they'll teach you in classes about the aerodynamics of how parachutes work, what speeds and what levels you have to be at, and all these. You can go down to the floor and they'll teach you how to pack your parachute and how it works and what to do. If you can know all about it, you make A's in all those classes. There's a big difference in that than when you're standing at the door of an airplane that's perfectly running fine at 20,000 feet looking down at the ground. You have a different kind of knowledge at that point, right? Like, you remember whenever before you had kids, you knew how to fix everybody's kid situation? You remember that? Then when you had kids, you're like, what in the world am I doing? That's the difference in book knowledge and experiential knowledge, right? The word that he's using here is the experiential knowledge. How do you know that the testing of your faith works patience? Because if you look back and think you've gone through stuff before, and what did it do? Did it help you? Did it prepare you? Did it make you stronger? That's what he's saying here. And then he says the testing of your faith. You know the testing of your faith or the proving of your faith. It's the same word that's used to describe the purification of metal. It's the same word used in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 7 where he says the proof of your faith. And that's the idea here. 1 Peter 1:7 is the only other occurrence of this word in the New Testament. But trials are a means to show us what our faith is made of. Not necessarily so that God can see, because God knows. It's to help us see what's going on. That we can come out the other side a little bit stronger, knowing a little bit more about what we need to be doing. And he says that it produces or it works thoroughly. This steadfastness, which is a word that just means to hold up or to bear up under something. You got a load on you, but you're not going to let it bring you down. You're going to hold it up, right? It's kind of like if you've ever had, my wife's had both of her knees replaced. If you've ever had a knee replacement, you know maybe the hardest part of it is not the surgery, it's the rehab, right? Because every stretch and every exercise hurts, and everybody's saying, why are they putting me through this? And the reason they're putting you through it is because if you don't strengthen those muscles now, you'll never get them back. That's the idea that's going on here. And when we understand that there's something good that can come out of it, our perspective changes. Our perspective determines our joy. One more real quick before we're dismissed is that number 4, trials perfect. That's what he says in verse 4. He says, let all steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. James is saying that testing brings about endurance, and that endurance or steadfastness we have, it brings perfection in our life. There's 3 parts to this, that it helps us to mature, it helps us to be complete or whole, it helps us to lack nothing. In other words, it helps us to face the next adversity. And it helps us, if you look at 2 Corinthians chapter 1, to know better how to help and serve others. Michelangelo was asked one time when he was making David, he said, what was it that was going through your mind when you saw that piece of stone there? And he said, I just saw the angel within it, and I started chipping away everything that didn't belong. See, it wasn't that he was thinking that I've got to make something. It was already there, and I've got to take away what doesn't need to be there, was the way he saw it, see. The idea is that's what God is. If you'd ask that piece of stone, what do you think about this? He'd say, it hurts. Quit beating on me. He's trying to bring out the best of it. That's what James says is God is doing for us. Our perspective determines our joy. Now in the next few verses, he tells us if we don't have that perspective, verses 5 through 8, he says, pray for wisdom. And God, and you can go through chapter 1 and see all the ways he describes God and how wonderful he is. He's a God that can be trusted and should be trusted. Maybe some of you are old enough to remember Kenny Rogers, some of his hits. Did you ever hear the song, The Greatest? About a little boy that's out in the yard, and he's got his bat, and he throws the ball up, and he swings, and he misses. Then he throws another ball up, and he swings, and he misses. Strike 2. Throws another ball up, and he's undeterred. He swings, and he misses. He struck out. And as the sun is fading and his mother's calling him into supper, in that last little verse, he says as he's walking to the house, not willing to be changed his mind about where he is, he says, I'm still the greatest, because even I didn't know that I was the greatest pitcher alive. He went from being the victim of a strikeout to the pitcher of a strikeout. Nothing changed except his perspective. Listen, I know it's hard when we're going through trials, when we're going through tough times, to have this kind of perspective. Again, it's something we got to work on in advance. But if we'll allow God to shape our way of thinking, if we'll try to see things from God's perspective, from an eternal perspective, from a heavenly perspective, and see the good that can come out not only from ourselves but from others, it helps us to have the proper perspective. And turn our gloom, despair, and agony on me to, I've got the joy, 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 joy down in my heart. Down in my heart. And if the devil doesn't like it, he can sit on attack. So let's pray and we'll be dismissed. Our Father, we love you and we're grateful that you've loved us and shown us through Jesus. We're grateful, Father, for the fact that as we live our lives here below and we realize we go through trials and tribulations and problems and difficulties, we realize that you're already there with us, that we don't walk those steps alone. And we realize that we have a family that loves us and cares for us in your family. Help us, Father, to lean on each other and to encourage one another. Help us to realize that you're not a God that can't be touched with our feelings, but you love us and care for us and want us to cast our cares and burdens before you. Help us, Father, as we go through this life to seek to have your perspective on all we do. And as we do so, may we be a bright and shining light to others to give them hope, to realize that there is a God, that you love us and care for us, and that one day we can spend an eternity with you because of your love and your mercy and grace in a place that we don't have to worry about all the things that so easily hurts us here in this life. Thank you for that hope. Thank you for this family. Thank you for the relationships that we have with each other and with you because of Jesus. It's in His name we pray. Amen. Thank you for your attention.